Hey everyone, it's Lisa from the blog farmhouseonboone.com, and today I want to show you how to make some long fermented sourdough biscuits. I'm going to dive right into the recipe. We'll talk more about the benefits to sourdough and why long fermented toward the end of this video if you're brand new. All right, we're going to start this process with 8 tablespoons of butter cut into chunks. Just like with normal biscuits, we're going to use cold butter. To that, we're going to add 1.5 cups of flour. I have some flour that I just pulled out of my grain mill. A video about that if you're interested, but I used some whole grain white flour that I milled fresh in my Nutri-Mill. Now I'm just going to cut this butter into the flour. Now, I know there are such things as pastry knives, but I'm just going to use my hands because it is the easiest way to do it. And you all know if you follow along that I use my hands a lot. Totally fine with me. All right, once that's nicely incorporated, I'm gonna add to that 1 cup of fed sourdough starter. So this is just starter that I fed with water and flour and allowed to sit out at room temperature for this time a lot longer. A lot of times I'll do about 8 hours, but I believe I fed this 24 hours ago now. All right, next I'm gonna add 1 tablespoon of honey. We use raw honey from a local Amish community in our area. And then just give it a stir until it's nicely incorporated. All right, now we wait. I'm just going to put a clean tea towel over top of this and allow it to sit out at room temperature for 8 to 24 hours. Now this of course depends on your level of tolerance for gluten as well as your taste preferences. The longer it sits, it'll get more sour. But if you are super sensitive to gluten, I have heard from several people that they can only tolerate 24-hour fermented grains. We can personally tolerate pretty much any grains in our family, so we will just do this whenever we're ready to make the biscuits, probably for breakfast tomorrow morning, and then we can go ahead and enjoy them. But if you want to wait the full 24 hours, make sure to get this soaking in the morning so that the next morning you can make your biscuits. All right, the next day, we're going to take the soaked mixture and add a few more things to it and then get to making the biscuits. We're gonna add 1 teaspoon of baking powder, 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, and 3/4 teaspoon of salt. And then just combine it together. Again, I like to use my fingers. Right now I'm just gonna roll these out on a lightly floured surface and cut the biscuits. I'm just gonna use this little antique cup measurer. You can also use the top of a regular mouth mason jar or even a wide mouth mason jar if you want to make really big biscuits. Either way, just something round will work great. Now, of course, you can use a rolling pin. Again, I just use my hands. Now, I'm gonna get mine going in a well-seasoned cast iron skillet. You also, of course, could use just a glass baking dish. Either will work great, and I just put my biscuits nice and close together. If you recall, this is a lot like my peach cobbler recipe, only without the peaches below. It's a little bit different when I'm making just biscuits, but the concept is pretty similar. For a little added height, you can allow the biscuits to rise for 30 minutes to an hour in a warm place before baking. Now I'm just gonna throw this in the oven for 15 to 20 minutes on 400 degrees. Then we'll be ready to butter them and serve them. All right, I forgot to mention this earlier, but you can use any kind of flour you have. You can use all-purpose, you can use einkorn or whole grain. I will point out that with any whole grain baked goods, it will be a little bit of a denser biscuit, but for the more fluffier, you might want to use all-purpose. Let's talk a little bit about the advantages of sourdough if you are brand new to that concept. If you've been hanging around my channel a while, you already know all about it, but basically, grains have an anti-nutrient on them called phytic acid, and soaking, souring, and sprouting, or any one of those, reduces that phytic acid content. And so making sourdough grain products makes it to where the part of the grain that's hard to digest, that makes a lot of people really sensitive to grains, is pre-done for you. So that is why we love our sourdough starter. It also adds a depth of flavor that you just cannot get at the store without going to some artisan bakery or something like that. So I shared on my channel how to make a sourdough starter. It's an older video, but it walks you through the whole process. And then I have tons of sourdough recipes. It's kind of my thing. And I have so many. On my blog, I have a page. If you go to farmhouseonboone.com, click on Food from Scratch, there is a drop-down menu that has sourdough recipes, and you can just scroll through those. There are so many. I also have several, obviously, on this channel. I have a whole sourdough recipes playlist, which I'll link below. We make everything from bread to pizza crust to English muffins, desserts, pancakes, all with sourdough starter, and it just is healthy and delicious. We love using our freshly milled whole grains to make these, and once you really get it into your routine and maintaining a starter, it's one of those things that does not seem hard. It seems really overwhelming up front, but then once you get really used to it, it's totally not. My little pet of a sourdough starter has been alive for 8+ years now. I feed it with fresh filtered water from my Berkey filter, which I have a review on as well, and my whole grains, and it's just so easy. It does not go wrong, even during the moving process. So we moved in January, and we were kind of not in a house for several weeks because we were getting things redone here. My starter even survived all of that. So once they're well established, they really aren't hard to maintain. Also, let's talk a little bit about adapting recipes for sourdough. So let's say you already have a favorite biscuit or a favorite pancake recipe, and you want to know how you can make it into a sourdough recipe that's long fermented. Because if you Google sourdough bread or you Google sourdough biscuits, you'll come up with things that aren't fermented with all of the grains. So it'll call for a cup of flour and a cup of starter, and you want to make sure that that cup of flour is also fermented by sitting out the night before. But how do you do that when the recipe doesn't tell you? So what you do is you want to take all of the liquid component of the recipe and combine that with the sourdough and the flour portion of the recipe. Now the reason for this is if you just combined the flour portion and the sourdough starter portion, you might find that there isn't enough liquid for it to come together and soak. It might be too hard of a ball of dough. But if the recipe calls for melted coconut oil or honey, you can throw those things in with it the night before, and that way the flour will be fully incorporated into the sourdough starter and can have that soaking process. Now some recipes just won't have enough liquid in them to make that happen. One way to account for this is sometimes if it calls for, say, sugar, you can make it honey instead to add a little bit of liquid, or you might just have to add as much of the flour as you possibly can to the starter, and then the next day add in the rest of it so that you at least soaked most of the flour, but not all of it if you can't get it all incorporated with the liquid content that the recipe calls for. I hope that makes sense, but that's how I've been able to adapt some recipes to be long fermented sourdough recipes. Now the good news is sourdough is really gaining in popularity, and so there actually are tons of recipes on the internet, including my website, that all have long fermented sourdough grains in it. And so you really don't necessarily have to adapt recipes anymore because there are just so many available. But if you do want to try your hand at that with maybe say your favorite brownie or cake recipe, I don't know, that might be something to try, you could do that. Now, I never usually add the eggs in as liquid because I don't really want the eggs sitting out overnight. That's something you have to consider. The things I will add in are water, honey, melted coconut oil, and then also I'm comfortable adding in raw milk, but if it's pasteurized milk, I'm not sure about that. Some people do. Use your own discretion on that, but that is a component of the recipe that I will use for the overnight soaking process. All right, well, I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you'll enjoy making some delicious sourdough biscuits for your family. They're great with butter, honey, cinnamon sugar, jam. So good for breakfast or even just maybe as another sandwich vessel, much like the English muffins. All right, well, if you're brand new to my channel, please hit that subscribe button. I make 2 new videos every week on food from scratch, natural living, and a handmade home. Thank you so much for stopping by the farmhouse.